Good evening. Arthur Hastings here, welcoming you once more to The Little Grey Cells. Tonight's tale, Death at the Venetian Carnival, another Hercule Poirot mystery that will test the very limits of logic and reason. Before we begin, I must convey Poirot's own appreciation, and mine, to our extraordinary audience spanning continents and time zones. New listeners, we would be most honored if you'd subscribe and share with us your location in the comments below. Now then, settle into your chair, Poirot, a proper tisane, as the great detective would insist, and join me in unraveling this most curious affair. Your grey cells are about to be put to work. Chapter 1. The City That Wears a Face. "The glass," said Monsieur Hercule Poirot, holding the stem of the goblet to the lamplight with the delicate reverence one might accord a first edition, "is not what it pretends to be." He set the piece down upon the green baize cloth with great precision, and permitted himself a small, private smile. It was, he reflected, a description that might be applied to a good deal more than antique Murano glass. It might be applied, for instance, to Venice herself, that improbable city which floated upon illusion as readily as upon water, her beauty perpetually rehearsed and her secrets perpetually submerged. He was, he acknowledged, in an excellent humour. The task which had brought him here was trivial, a mere matter of authentication undertaken as a favour to Sir Geoffrey Anstruther of Berkeley Square, who collected Venetian glass with the passion of a man who has nothing more troubling to collect. But trivial tasks had their virtues. They allowed a man to breathe. And Poirot, stepping from the water taxi onto the private landing stage of the Palazzo Malumbra on a late afternoon in February, breathed Venice in with the cautious appreciation of one who knows that beautiful things are rarely simple. The palazzo rose from the canal like a memory of itself. Its facade, stripped of much of its former ornament, retained a severe elegance. Tall shuttered windows, stone weathered to the colour of old ivory, and above the doorway a carved crest, worn smooth by the centuries until only the suggestion of a lion remained. Inside, a manservant of advanced years and expressionless face conducted Poirot through a corridor that smelled faintly of wax polish, sea salt, and old velvet, and up a staircase whose marble steps were cold even through the soles of his carefully polished shoes. It was his old acquaintance, Signor Alfredo Grimani, retired antiquities dealer, occasional expert witness, and tireless correspondent, who had insisted upon the Palazzo Malumbra. "There is nowhere more civilized in Venice," Grimani had written in his looping, emphatic hand. "And the Contessa sets a table that would not shame the Danieli. You will be comfortable, mon ami, and you will not be bored." Poirot had arrived in good time for dinner, which was served in a high-ceilinged dining room lit by a chandelier that trembled when the boats passed on the canal below, sending long shivers of light across the frescoed walls. The frescoes themselves were of considerable age and considerable fading. Mythological scenes in which gods and nymphs had grown indistinct, their expressions blurred by time into something that might equally have been rapture or dismay. It was Carnival season, and in deference to the city's oldest tradition, small gilded masks had been placed beside each table setting. A charming affectation, the Countess explained, which her guests were at liberty to wear or to disregard as they chose. Several had chosen to wear them, and the effect in the trembling candlelight was festive and faintly unnerving. The Countess Alessandra Malumbra presided at the head of the table with the composed authority of a woman who has long since ceased to require anyone's approval. She was perhaps 60, though she wore her age as an aristocrat wears a title, acknowledgedly and without apology. Her hair was silver, dressed with considerable art. Her gown was black. Her eyes, dark and steady beneath level brows, moved across her guests with the practiced assessment of a hostess who has been observing people for a very long time. She had greeted Poirot in the entrance hall with a graciousness that was entirely genuine and entirely measured. "We are honoured," she had said with a slight inclination of her head, "to have such a distinguished guest. I trust the Palazzo will answer your requirements, Monsieur Poirot." And then, with the perfect timing of a woman who knows when a sentence is complete, she had turned to receive the next arrival. The other guests assembled themselves gradually around the long table. Poirot, who had arrived last, and therefore had the advantage of observing those already seated, applied himself to this task with a quiet thoroughness that his associates sometimes mistook for distraction. At the countess's right sat a young woman whom Poirot identified after a moment as Elena Rossi, the countess's personal companion, he had been told by Grimani's letter. She was perhaps 28, dark-haired, with a stillness about her that was less composure than containment. She spoke when addressed and smiled when required, but her eyes, Poirot noticed, returned again and again to the countess, with an attention that was not quite that of an employee. Across the table, deep in conversation with a negligible amount of wine and a considerable quantity of absorbed interest, sat Marco Bellini. He was a slender man of perhaps 40, with the pale, slightly distracted air of someone who spends a great deal of time in archives and rather too little time in the open air. He was, Grimani had mentioned, a historian, writing a book about the collapse of the great Venetian families. An irony, Poirot thought, that he should be a guest in one of their houses, beside Bellini, and contrasting with him, in every particular, sat Dr. Luca Ferraro. Where Bellini was angular and abstracted, Ferraro was polished and present. A man in his middle 50s, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped silver hair, and the unhurried manner of a physician who has learned over many years to appear untroubled. He wore his evening clothes with the ease of long habit. His hands, Poirot noted, were very still. And then there was Clara Hastings. She was English. That much was apparent before she opened her mouth, which she did frequently, and without particular concern for the opinions of others. She was perhaps 50, with paint-stained fingers that no amount of preparation had entirely corrected, and the direct, unguarded gaze of a woman who has decided that the effort of concealment is, on the whole, not worth it. She wore a dress of deep amber that suited her rather better than she appeared to realize, and she had declined the Carnival mask entirely. "I find them sinister," she announced to the table at large, shortly after the soup had been served. "All this dressing up, pretending to be someone else. I never see the point." "But surely," said Bellini with gentle amusement, "that is precisely the point of Carnival. One removes one's face in order to discover what lies beneath." "In my experience," said Clara Hastings without heat, "what lies beneath is usually very much what you expected." Ferraro smiled, a controlled, professionally agreeable smile. "You are perhaps an exceptionally perceptive judge of character, Signora Hastings." "I've been painting faces for 30 years, she said. "You learn to see through them eventually." Poirot, who had been attending to his risotto with every appearance of absorption, permitted himself a glance beneath his lashes at Dr. Ferraro. The physician's smile had not altered. But his eyes, for just a moment, had met Clara Hastings with an expression that was not precisely surprise, and not precisely alarm, and was not, in any case, that of a stranger. The sixth guest arrived late, with apologies and a cloud of expensive cologne. Sebastian Ward was a large man, physically large, in the manner of someone who has always occupied a great deal of space and found it perfectly natural that he should do so. He was English, perhaps 55, with a broad, florid face and the genial expansiveness of a man who likes to be liked, and usually is. He settled into his chair with the ease of a man arriving at his own table, accepted wine with the ease of a man who has been accepting wine for a very long time, and turned almost immediately to the countess with the beam of someone who considers himself a particular favourite. "Contessa, you've outdone yourself. The place looks extraordinary." He swept a glance around the room with the cheerful acquisitiveness of a man who prices things by instinct. "These frescoes, quite remarkable. Must be worth a packet, eh?" A barely perceptible compression appeared at the corner of the Countess's mouth. "They are part of the Palazzo's history," she said. "We do not think of them in those terms." "No, no, of course not," said Ward, not remotely abashed. "Quite right. Though I suppose when one is surrounded by history daily, one ceases to appreciate it. Whereas he spread his hands in a gesture of rueful self-deprecation that Poirot found instinctively rather too fluent. I'm afraid I appreciate everything in the most terribly vulgar terms. Occupational hazard, finance." He laughed. It was a large laugh, well constructed, and it served its purpose. The table relaxed marginally. Only Bellini, Poirot noticed, did not relax at all. And then, over the roasted guinea fowl, Bellini said something that Poirot found very interesting indeed. He had been discussing, with the measured enthusiasm of a scholar, his research into the histories of the old Venetian families. The complex web of marriages, inheritances, and financial catastrophes that had, over 3 centuries, reduced so many of the great houses to shadows of themselves. "It is remarkable," he said, in a thoughtful, almost dreamy tone, as though speaking to himself rather than to the table, "how many of these families simply ceased to exist. Not through war, not through poverty in any ordinary sense, but through, shall we say, accident, unhappy circumstance, the kind of calamity that arrives at exactly the moment when it is most convenient for some parties and most inconvenient for others." The silence that followed was perhaps 2 seconds in duration. No more. But in those 2 seconds the Countess's hand stopped moving above her wine-glass. Dr. Ferraro's gaze dropped to his plate with a deliberateness that was itself a small, precise action. Clara Hastings abruptly addressed Ward on the subject of the Aqua Alta, with an energy that bore no relation whatsoever to her interest in the topic. And Sebastian Ward laughed. That large, comfortable laugh, and said, "Oh, I imagine half of them simply drank themselves to death, like sensible people." Nobody contradicted him. Later, when the evening had dissolved into good nights and retreating footsteps and the distant sound of carnival music drifting through the tall windows, Poirot descended once more to the ground floor, in search of a glass of water he did not particularly require. He found the corridor outside the salon in darkness, but through the half-open door came a faint light. A single lamp burning low. He paused. Eleanor Rossi stood before a large portrait that dominated the far wall of the salon. It depicted a man of middle age, painted in the heavy, formal style of 70 or 80 years past. Dark-coated, severe, his expression holding the particular authority of someone who has never been required to justify himself. Below the portrait, a small brass plate bore a name: Count Alberto Malumbra. The young woman was very still. She stood with her arms at her sides, and she was looking at the portrait with an expression of such concentrated, private intensity that Poirot felt, with unusual acuteness, that he was witnessing something not intended for any audience. There were tears on her face. Not dramatic tears. Not the tears of crisis or grief performed for observers, but the quiet, helpless tears of someone in the presence of something they cannot change and cannot leave alone. A board creaked beneath Poirot's foot. Elena Rossi turned. For one unguarded moment, her face was entirely open, stunned and raw, and something else besides, something that Poirot, in his long experience of human beings under pressure, recognized without being able immediately to name. Then the composure returned, smoothly and quickly, like water closing over a stone. "Monsieur Poirot," she said. Her voice was quite steady. "You are lost, perhaps?" "I sought only a glass of water," said Poirot pleasantly. "I appear to have found the wrong door. I apologize for the intrusion, Signorina Rossi." "Not at all." She moved towards him, pulling the salon door closed behind her with a quiet definitiveness. "The kitchen is at the end of the corridor, on the left. Buonanotte, monsieur." "Buonanotte," said Poirot. He watched her go up the stairs, her back perfectly straight, her footsteps silent, and stood for a moment in the darkened corridor. Behind the closed door of the salon, the portrait of Count Malumbra looked at nothing, as portraits do. But Poirot, in the privacy of his own thoughts, was looking at rather a great deal. He was still looking at it when, from somewhere beneath him, from the canal that ran below the Palazzo's foundations, he heard the sound of a gondola drawing up to the private steps. There was a low voice, indistinct, and the faint knock of a pole against stone. Then silence. Then the gondola moved on. Poirot listened to the water settle. He thought about a painting that had recently been moved. He had noticed the clean, unfaded square of wall behind the escritoire in the salon, where a smaller work had hung until, perhaps quite recently. He thought about the very faint smell of bitter almonds he had detected in passing the corridor outside Dr. Ferraro's room, which had vanished so promptly that he might have imagined it, and had not. He thought about a historian who spoke of convenient accidents in a room full of people with secrets. Then he went to bed, having found, as it happened, that he no longer wanted the water at all. Something was coming. Of that, Hercule Poirot was quite certain. Chapter 2. A chord. Out of tune. The fog arrived before dawn. Poirot, who had always maintained that the human body required precisely 8 hours of sleep, and who enforced this requirement upon himself with the same disciplined authority he applied to the arrangement of his breakfast table, was nevertheless awake at 6 o'clock, and standing at his window when the canal below disappeared entirely. Venice, it seemed, could dissolve at will. One moment the narrow waterway glittered with the first pale light. The next, it was simply gone, absorbed into a whiteness so complete that the Palazzo might have been adrift upon nothing at all. He found the effect, on the whole, unpleasant. There was a quality to this particular fog that reminded him of something he could not quite name, a deliberateness, as though the city were drawing a curtain across itself for reasons of its own. He stood at the window for several minutes, his small, neat figure reflected faintly in the cold glass, and then he turned away and applied himself to the consideration of what he had observed the previous evening. The facts, as he arranged them in his mind, were these. Two people who were not strangers had performed the comedy of strangeness with considerable competence. Ferraro and Clara Hastings, whose exchange at dinner had carried the particular strain of persons reciting lines they have agreed in, advance to recite. A painting had been removed from the salon wall within, he estimated, the past fortnight. The unfaded rectangle behind the escritoire was too clean for an older displacement. The smell of bitter almonds, fleeting and sauceless, outside Ferraro's room. A gondola that stopped at the private landing by night and then thought better of it. And Elena Rossi, weeping before a dead man's portrait, with the helpless privacy of someone who does so regularly and alone. Poirot adjusted the perfectly symmetrical arrangement of objects on his dressing table by a fraction, and considered whether any of this amounted to anything beyond the ordinary human unhappiness that gathers, inevitably, in old houses with long histories. He concluded with some regret that it amounted to rather more than that. Breakfast at the Palazzo Malumbra was served in a small room off the main corridor, with windows giving onto a courtyard where a stone well stood green with moss, and a single orange tree had survived the winter with the stoic tenacity of something very old and very determined. The table was laid for 6, and the guests arrived in the uneven sequence of people who have not yet agreed upon the social contract of a shared morning. Clara Hastings came first, already dressed for outdoors in a paint-spattered coat that she wore with complete unconsciousness, carrying a notebook in which she had been sketching. She sat down, poured coffee for herself without waiting to be offered any, and opened the notebook to a fresh page. She was, Poirot thought, one of those rare people who are entirely at ease in their own company, who carry their interior life around them like a country one can retreat into at will. He sat across from her and, after a comfortable silence, remarked that the fog appeared to have settled in. "It does that at Carnival," she said without looking up from her page. "The Venetians say it's the city hiding its face. Rather like the masks, I suppose, though I still find those sinister." She paused, her pencil hovering. "Did you sleep?" "Adequately, I thank you. You're an early riser, Signora Hastings." "Always. The light before 9 is entirely different, softer, more honest." She glanced up then with the directness he had already come to associate with her. "Are you here for the glass, really? Grimani mentioned it, but you don't strike me as a man who comes to Venice over glassware." "And yet," said Poirot pleasantly, "here I am." She studied him for a moment with the assessing eye of her profession, as though considering whether to commit him to paper. Then she smiled, a genuine smile, unpracticed and rather appealing, and returned to her sketch. "I suppose everyone is entitled to a cover story," she said. Poirot, who had not moved a muscle, found this observation very interesting indeed. Ward arrived at breakfast with the expansive bonhomie of a man who considers himself consistently good company, helped himself to a quantity of everything, and immediately began a loud conversation with nobody in particular about the relative merits of Venetian hotels. Bellini followed shortly after, abstracted and pale, carrying a leather satchel that he set beside his chair with the instinctive protectiveness of a man guarding something he considers irreplaceable. Ferraro came last, immaculate and unhurried. He took his seat, accepted coffee from the silent manservant, and unfolded his napkin with the measured composure of a man who has trained himself very thoroughly not to betray anything in public. He and Clara Hastings did not look at one another. This, Poirot reflected, was itself a form of communication, a studiedly ordinary omission that required, in fact, a good deal of effort to sustain. Two people who have genuinely never met do not need to avoid meeting one another's eyes. They simply do not happen to. Ward, apparently immune to atmosphere of any kind, turned to Bellini with cheerful curiosity. "This book of yours, Venetian families, all that, must turn up all sorts of extraordinary things. Scandals, I mean. Dark secrets buried in the archives." Bellini looked at him with an expression of polite neutrality. History is, on the whole, a record of human behaviour. It contains everything human behaviour contains. "Skeletons in cupboards, eh?" Ward laughed. "I should think Venice has more than its share. All these old palazzi, who knows what went on in them?" He gestured vaguely at the ceiling, as though the palazzo's past were located somewhere overhead. Take this place, for instance, the Countess's family, going back centuries. Must be fascinating research territory, right under your nose. The silence that ensued was perhaps a degree cooler than the previous one. "I do not study living families," said Bellini, precisely and finally, and applied himself to his bread. Ferraro reached for the coffee pot with a hand that was, Poirot noted with attention, not quite as still as usual. After breakfast, Poirot undertook what he privately described as a small constitutional. A measured circuit of the Palazzo's accessible rooms and corridors that bore to an uninformed observer every appearance of an elderly gentleman familiarizing himself with his surroundings and rather losing his way in the process. He visited the kitchen on the pretext of complimenting the cook upon the previous evening's risotto. And while he was there, he observed that the wine glasses from dinner had been washed and replaced in the cabinet, with the single exception of one which stood apart on the wooden draining board, its stem wrapped carefully in a cloth. He did not draw attention to this. He thanked the cook, who was gratified, and departed. He visited the garden terrace, accessible through a pair of glass doors at the rear of the main corridor. It was a narrow terrace of cracked stone that ran along the back of the palazzo, overlooking the canal. The iron railing was old and, in places, insecure. Below, the water moved with its customary silence, dark and opaque. On the stone balustrade, partly sheltered by a stone planter whose contents had long since perished, he found a small object that the fog had dampened but not obscured. It was a cigarette end, quite recent. The brand was English. He left it where it lay. Then he found the salon and stood for some time before the wall behind the escritoire, studying the clean, pale rectangle with his head tilted at a slight angle. The frame hooks were still in the plaster, two of them set rather wider apart than the hooks required for the painting currently hung nearby. Whatever had been removed had been larger. A portrait, perhaps, of the scale that the palazzo's walls generally preferred. He was still considering this when he heard voices in the corridor. Elena Rossi and, unmistakably, Sebastian Ward. He did not move. The door was ajar. "Perfectly straightforward request," Ward was saying, in the reasonable, slightly pressured tone of a man accustomed to negotiation. "I'm not asking for anything the Countess couldn't spare. Simply a conversation. Privately. This evening, if that suits. The Contessa's time is not mine to arrange." Elena's voice was level, but Poirot could detect in it the particular flatness of controlled anger. "If you wish to speak with her, you must ask her directly." "I've found," said Ward with a warmth that did not quite succeed, that the direct approach is not always the most productive. You understand me, I think." A brief pause. "I understand you perfectly, Signor Ward," said Elena, "and my answer is the same." Her footsteps moved away down the corridor. Ward's did not follow immediately. For a moment he simply stood there. Poirot could see nothing through the narrow gap, but the quality of the silence suggested a man recalculating. And then he too departed, in the opposite direction. Poirot remained in the salon for another moment. Then he crossed to the escritoire, opened the shallow central drawer, and found within it, beneath a blotter and 2 unused envelopes, the faint circular impression left in the aged wood by something that had rested there for years and been recently removed. The circumference was consistent with the base of a small safe, of the wall-mounted variety, recessed into plaster. He closed the drawer with the same quietness with which he had opened it. A hidden safe, now hidden elsewhere, or emptied. A glass set apart in the kitchen, an Englishman conducting quiet negotiations that the object of those negotiations clearly wished to refuse. And everywhere beneath the Palazzo's composed and handsome surface, the particular tension of people who know too much about one another and have agreed, for reasons of mutual preservation, to know nothing at all. Poirot straightened his already straight cuffs and went to find his coat. Venice, he had decided, required a walk, or rather Poirot required a walk, and Venice, for all her peculiarities of infrastructure, would simply have to accommodate him. He returned at midday to find the Palazzo subtly altered. The manservant who admitted him wore an expression that was not quite his customary blankness. In the entrance hall, 2 of the guest doors on the upper corridor stood an inch ajar in the manner of rooms hurriedly left rather than deliberately opened. From somewhere above came the sound of a woman's voice, low, rapid, with the urgent rhythm of someone delivering unwelcome news. Poirot ascended the stairs at his usual unhurried pace. On the first landing he encountered Bellini, who was descending with his leather satchel held a degree too tightly, and his face arranged in an expression of careful calm that had clearly been assembled in the last few minutes. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot." The historian paused. Something moved behind his eyes. "You have been out?" "A small promenade only." Poirot regarded him with benign interest. "You are going somewhere, Monsieur Bellini?" "The archive. I have work." A beat's hesitation, very slight, but perceptible. "I find the mornings here unsettling, for concentration." "Indeed," said Poirot. "Old houses have that quality sometimes. They make one feel that the past is insufficiently past." He smiled pleasantly. "Buona giornata, monsieur." Bellini descended without further comment, his footsteps quickening as he reached the ground floor. Poirot stood on the landing and listened to the silence that the Palazzo settled back into. The slow creak of ancient timber, the distant lap of the canal, and, from somewhere behind the closed door of the Countess's private apartments, a sound so small he might have imagined it, the sound of a key turning in a lock. Poirot tilted his egg-shaped head. In his considerable experience, people locked doors for one of 2 reasons: to keep something in or to keep something out. The distinction in the present circumstances struck him as rather important. He descended to lunch with the expression of a man who has found, in an otherwise quiet morning, precisely enough to be going on with. Chapter 3. The Man in the Canal. It was the cook who found him. She had gone down to the private dock at 7:30 in the morning to receive a delivery of vegetables, a Tuesday arrangement of long standing, and had found instead Sebastian Ward, face downward in the canal, his evening coat spread about him in the water like dark wings, and upon his face the gilded carnival mask that he had worn at dinner 2 evenings before. The cook, who was a practical woman of 60 with no particular appetite for drama, screamed once with great efficiency and then went upstairs to inform the countess. By 8 o'clock, the police had arrived. 2 officers in a launch, followed shortly by a third in plain clothes, who introduced himself as Ispettore Gavini and who had the weary, considering look of a man who has been called away from breakfast once too often. He was perhaps 45, lean, with a precise dark moustache, and the manner of someone who forms conclusions quickly and revises them reluctantly. Poirot, descending at his customary hour to find the Palazzo's ground floor occupied by uniforms and agitated guests, assessed the situation in approximately 30 seconds and said nothing whatsoever to anyone. He accepted the cup of coffee that the shaken manservant pressed upon him, retired to a chair at the far end of the entrance hall, and observed. The guests had gathered in the way that people do when a sudden death has removed the ordinary social architecture that tells them where to stand. Clara Hastings sat on the bottom stair with her arms around her knees, very white but entirely controlled. Bellini stood by the window with his back to the room, staring at the fog. Elena Rossi remained beside the Countess throughout, not hovering, not consoling, but simply present, in the manner of a person who has decided that presence is the only useful contribution available. Ferraro was not in the room. He arrived 10 minutes later from the direction of the rear corridor, buttoning his coat with rather more attention than the operation required. He took in the scene, expressed the appropriate concern, and positioned himself near the Countess with the ease of a man who habitually gravitates toward authority in uncertain situations. Ispettore Gavini noticed none of this. He was, at that moment, supervising the removal of Ward's body from the canal with the focused competence of a professional attending to an immediate task. Poirot watched him and thought, "This one is thorough. Whether he is imaginative, we shall have to determine." The Ispettore's preliminary conclusion reached by mid-morning and communicated to the assembled guests in the salon with the brisk, regretful efficiency of an official delivering established fact, was that Sebastian Ward had drowned. The Signor Ward was seen by the night porter returning to the Palazzo at approximately 11:30, Gavini said. His room shows the evidence that he changed into his evening coat, presumably for the carnival festivities in the Campo nearby, which continued past midnight. It is our belief that he went onto the garden terrace, which he had been observed to frequent, and that at some point during the night, in the fog and the darkness, he lost his footing at the railing and fell into the canal below. A short silence received this. "He could not swim?" asked Bellini quietly. "We do not yet know. The railing on the eastern side of the terrace is, as some of you may be aware, not entirely secure." Gavini surveyed the room. "I must ask each of you to remain available for a brief conversation this morning. A formality, you understand, but a necessary one." Poirot, from his chair in the corner, looked at his coffee cup. The conclusion was not unreasonable. It was, in fact, precisely the conclusion that the scene had been arranged to produce. Ward on the terrace. He had been there before. The English cigarette end was evidence enough of that. The insecure railing, the fog. A man who had, by all appearances, been drinking. It was entirely plausible. It was also wrong. Poirot had seen the body before it was removed from the upper terrace doorway while Gavini's officers were still occupied at the dock below. He had not gone down. He had not needed to. From that elevation, at that angle, one thing had been unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for, and had trained himself over many decades to look for precisely that. Sebastian Ward's lips, in the grey morning light, carried a faint but perceptible bluish cast that was not consistent with drowning, and there was no coughing, no evidence of the involuntary struggle that cold canal water produces in a living man. He had entered the canal, Poirot was quite certain, as a dead weight. He had not drowned in the canal. He had been put there. Ispettore Gavini conducted his conversations in the library, a room of impressive shelves and very little recent reading, and Poirot, who had not been summoned and had not invited himself, nevertheless found the door ajar when he passed it at approximately 11 o'clock and paused to appreciate the ventilation. Clara Hastings from within was saying, "I went to bed at 10. I heard nothing after midnight. I'm afraid I can't tell you anything more useful than that. You did not hear the Signor Ward leave the Palazzo?" "I did not." A pause. He was not a quiet man, generally, but the rooms here are thick-walled. "Did you know Signor Ward before your arrival at the Palazzo?" The pause that followed was perhaps a second longer than necessary. "We had met, briefly, several years ago. We were not acquainted in any meaningful sense." Gavini thanked her. His manner suggested he found this satisfactory. Poirot, in the corridor, found it rather less so. The hesitation had been small, but Clara Hastings was not, in general, a woman given to hesitation. She answered questions as she poured coffee, immediately and for herself. He moved on before she emerged. The handkerchief was discovered at 11:30. One of Gavini's officers, conducting a final examination of the dock area, retrieved it from the water at the foot of the steps where the body had been found, snagged apparently on an iron ring set into the stone. It was silk, ivory in colour, fine, with an embroidered monogram in the corner. The initials were A.M. Gavini examined it for some time without speaking. Then he looked up and found Poirot standing at a polite distance, apparently absorbed in the architectural details of the canal wall. "Monsieur Poirot." The Ispettore's tone was measured. "You are, I understand, something of an authority in these matters." "I am an old man taking the air," said Poirot. "The architecture of Venice is most instructive." Gavini regarded him with the expression of a man who is not, in fact, deceived, but who chooses his battles with some discrimination. He held up the handkerchief. "Alessandra Malumbra, the Countess's initials." "So one observes." "It is possible the Signor Ward had occasion to borrow it. It is possible it fell from his pocket during the evening. It is possible a great many things." Gavini folded the handkerchief with careful fingers. "It is also possible that the Signor Ward was not entirely the victim of an unfortunate accident." "You are thorough, Ispettore," said Poirot. "It is a quality I admire very much." Gavini looked at him for a moment. "I will be speaking with the Contessa this afternoon. I would be grateful, Monsieur Poirot, if you would make yourself available thereafter. Your observations of the household over the past 2 days may be of some value." He paused. "Informally, you understand." "But of course," said Poirot. "Informally." He did not go immediately to find the Countess. Instead, he climbed to the garden terrace and stood for some time at the eastern railing, the section Gavini had described as insecure, and tested it with both hands. It gave slightly, not dramatically, not the wobble of something about to collapse, but with the tolerant looseness of metalwork, long accustomed to the sea air, and long since past caring about it. A man leaning heavily might, in darkness and fog, have found it insufficient. It was possible, but the railing's surface told a quieter story. Along the top bar, where hands grip by instinct when a person leans out over water, the salt-encrusted iron showed two areas of disturbance, smears where the grime had been partially cleared. Both were at the height of a person gripping from above, not below. Not the grasp of a man falling outward, clutching for support. The marks ran inward towards the palazzo. Someone had held the railing from this side while leaning over, looking down perhaps, or lowering something. Poirot stood back. Below him the canal received the morning without comment, its surface moving in slow, indifferent rhythms. The fog had thinned to a grey haze, and through it the opposite wall of the canal was dimly visible. Old brick, a shuttered window, the iron staple of a vanished awning. He thought about the wineglass standing alone on the kitchen draining board, wrapped in its cloth. He thought about bitter almonds, which had their own particular chemistry and their own particular history in the annals of crime. He thought about Ward in the corridor, applying quiet pressure to Elena Rossi, with the practiced ease of a man for whom such pressure was a habitual instrument. And he thought about the handkerchief. A.M. Alessandra Malumbra, found clenched, the officer had used that word, clenched, in a dead man's hand. Or found, rather, at the foot of the steps where the dead man had been put into the water. The distinction was important. Clenched implied a struggle, a final grasp, an accusation written in silk. Found snagged on an iron ring implied something else entirely. It implied that the handkerchief had been placed, and, if it had been placed, then whoever placed it had done so not in haste, not in the confusion of violence, but with sufficient deliberateness to choose the right object, the right location, and the right monogram. This was not the act of a frightened person covering their tracks. It was the act of someone directing attention. The question that Poirot turned over in his mind as he descended from the terrace, his expression one of mild and general contentment that deceived, he was aware, absolutely no one, was not merely who had killed Sebastian Ward, it was who they wished to see blamed for it. Chapter 4. What the Heart Conceals. Suspicion, Poirot had long observed, does not spread through a household like water, evenly finding its own level. It spreads like fire, unevenly, hungrily, consuming what is nearest first and leaving the rest to smoulder. By afternoon, the Palazzo Malumbra was smouldering considerably. The news of the handkerchief had not been officially communicated to the guests. It had not needed to be. Gavini's officers spoke to one another in the corridors with the frank assumption of invisibility that uniforms sometimes produce, and the Palazzo's ancient walls, as Poirot had already noted, were not as thick as they appeared. By luncheon, a meal attended by everyone except the countess, who sent word that she was indisposed. The fact of the embroidered initials had achieved the status of established knowledge, and the conversation around the table had taken on the strained, overloud quality of people discussing everything except the one subject occupying every mind. Bellini was the first to say it aloud. He set down his fork with a precision that drew the eye and said, very quietly, "The Contessa had reasons, of course. If Ward was pressing her for something she was not disposed to give." Clara Hastings looked at him sharply. That is a very large inference from a handkerchief. It is not an inference, it is an observation. Bellini's tone was measured, academic entirely without heat, which made it, Poirot thought, considerably more damaging than anger would have been. Ward was asking questions about this household, about its history, about things that certain people here would prefer to remain unexamined. Anyone who spent 10 minutes in his company understood that. Ferraro, who had been eating with the determined application of a man who has decided that normality is the appropriate response to abnormal circumstances, said, without looking up, "You are speaking of things you do not understand, Bellini." "Then perhaps," said Bellini pleasantly, "someone might explain them to me." Nobody did. Elena Rossi, who had not spoken since she sat down, kept her eyes on her plate throughout. When the meal concluded, she left the room first, quietly and without ceremony, and Poirot noticed that her hands, as she folded her napkin, were quite steady. It was, he had come to understand, Eleanor's particular form of distress. Not trembling, not pallor, but a stillness so complete it resembled the stillness of something held rigidly in place. Gavini found Poirot in the courtyard at 3 o'clock, seated on a stone bench beside the ancient well, apparently engaged in the contemplation of the orange tree. The ispettore carried his hat in his hand and wore the expression of a man who has spent the morning collecting information and the afternoon discovering that information is not the same thing as understanding. "The Contessa," he said, sitting beside Poirot without preamble, "denies that the handkerchief is hers. She says she has not owned such an article in several years, and that anyone might have obtained a handkerchief bearing those initials. She is, of course, entirely correct." "She is," agreed Poirot. "She is also," said Gavini carefully, "a woman who answers questions with the fluency of someone who has considered, in advance, which questions she is likely to be asked." He turned his hat in his hands. "In your experience, Monsieur Poirot, is that the behaviour of an innocent person?" "In my experience," said Poirot, "it is the behaviour of a person who is accustomed to protecting something. Whether that something is their innocence of this particular matter or their guilt in some other is a question the handkerchief alone cannot resolve." Gavini was quiet for a moment. In the orange tree, a small bird performed a brief, urgent transaction with a higher branch and departed. "The preliminary medical examination," the ispettore said, "suggests that Ward may have been dead before he entered the water. We are awaiting a fuller report. In the meantime, I am treating this as a suspicious death." He paused. "I would be grateful, as I said, for your informal assistance." "You are generous," said Poirot. He studied the orange tree. "I will tell you one thing, ispettore, which may or may not be useful. The handkerchief was placed deliberately by someone who wished your attention directed towards the Contessa. Whether that someone killed Ward or merely took advantage of his death to settle an old account, I cannot yet say. But the intention behind it was not concealment. It was accusation." Gavini looked at him steadily. "You are telling me the scene was composed." "I am telling you," said Poirot, with the slight smile of a man enjoying the precise use of language, "that someone in this palazzo has a taste for theatre. And in my experience, that is always interesting." He found Clara Hastings on the upper terrace at 4:30, standing at the intact section of railing with a sketchbook open and a stick of charcoal moving in short, decisive strokes across the page. She was drawing the canal, not the picturesque. canal of the guidebooks, but its working reality. The slick stone walls, the waterline dark with weed, the way the afternoon light fell flat and cold across the surface. She did not look up when he approached, but she moved along the bench to make room, with the instinctive courtesy of someone accustomed to sharing outdoor spaces with others who simply want to be near something. Poirot sat. For a few minutes he said nothing, and she continued drawing, and the canal moved below them with its customary indifference to human arrangements. "You draw what is actually there," he observed at length, "not what one expects to see. There's no use drawing what everyone already imagines," she said. "The imagination does that well enough without assistance." "You have lived with loss," said Poirot, very gently. "It shows in your work. Not as a wound, as a kind of honesty. The capacity to look at a thing directly without the comfort of prettiness." Clara Hastings's charcoal stopped moving. She looked at the page for a moment. "Grimani told you about my daughter," she said. It was not a question, and it carried no resentment, only the flat acknowledgement of someone long accustomed to being, in certain circles, a person with a story. "He mentioned only that you had suffered a bereavement. The nature of it I deduce from the work." Poirot paused. "Forgive me, I do not raise it to cause pain. I raise it because I think you are a person of considerable courage and considerable perceptiveness, and I find myself wondering what you have perceived in this household that you have not yet chosen to share." She was quiet for long enough that the canal produced 3 separate ripples and absorbed them. Then she said, "Ward was not what he appeared. Few people are. He knew things about Luca." She used the Christian name without apparent awareness of having done so, and did not correct it. "Medical things, from years ago. I don't know the specifics. Luca never told me the specifics. But Ward had some document, or knowledge of some document, that gave him a lever. That's the word, isn't it? A lever." She said the word with distaste, as though it were an implement she had found in an unlikely place. "He used it, carefully and consistently and with great good cheer, the way men like that do. And you knew this because Dr. Ferraro told you." Another silence, shorter this time. "We were close once, a long time ago, in the way that people are close when they are both far from home and both rather unhappy, which produces an intimacy that does not always survive the return of ordinary life." She resumed her drawing, a single firm line along the base of the canal wall. "We are not close now, but one does not entirely forget what a person has confided. He confided the existence of the document, but not its contents. He said it concerned a patient, a death 20 years ago in which his conduct had been, his word, irregular. He would not say more than that." She looked up then directly, as was her habit. "I am telling you this because Ward is dead, and because I do not think Luca killed him, and because I think if I do not tell someone with the capacity to use it properly, it will be used improperly by someone else, namely your ispettore, who is competent and entirely wrong." Poirot regarded her with warm approval. "You are, Signora Hastings, a most rational woman." "I'm a practical one," she said, "which is not always the same thing." She turned back to her sketchbook. "Now, if you don't mind, the light is going." He descended to the ground floor with Clara Hastings' information arranged in his mind alongside everything else, not as a solution, for it was nowhere near that yet, but as a piece whose edges could now be tested against adjacent pieces. Ferraro, a patient, a death 20 years ago, irregular conduct. And Ward, with his comfortable smile and his English cigarettes and his leveraging, holding a document that connected them all. The ground floor corridor was empty. The salon door stood open. Poirot paused at the threshold. The room was as he had last seen it. The frescoed walls, the trembling chandelier now still in the afternoon quiet, the portraits of dead Malumbras, looking out from their accumulated centuries, the escritoire in its corner, the empty rectangle of wall above it, where a painting had not yet been replaced. But something was different. He stood very still for a moment, his eyes moving across the room with the methodical patience of a man rereading a page he has already memorized, looking for the altered word. Then he found it. The escritoire drawer was not fully closed. A quarter inch, no more, of aged walnut showed at the front. He had closed it himself that morning. He was quite certain of this, as he was certain of all such things. He crossed the room, opened the drawer, and examined the interior. The blotter was undisturbed. The envelopes were where he had left them. The circular impression in the old wood was as before, but in the back left corner of the drawer, caught against the wood grain where it had fallen or been pushed, was a small square of paper, folded once. He lifted it with 2 careful fingers and unfolded it. It was a receipt from a locksmith in the Cannaregio district, dated 3 weeks earlier, for the removal and relocation of a wall-mounted safe. The name on the receipt, written in a clerk's neat hand, was Elena Rossi. Poirot refolded the paper, replaced it precisely where he had found it, and closed the drawer with a quietness that the empty room absorbed without trace. He stood for a moment with his hands at his sides and his eyes directed at no particular point, in the attitude of concentrated inwardness that those who knew him recognized as the little grey cells conducting their most purposeful work. Elena Rossi had moved the safe. Elena Rossi had placed the handkerchief. And Elena Rossi, when asked if she had seen Ward after midnight, had said no. Not with fear in her face, but with something that Poirot had identified in the entrance hall on the night of Ward's death as protectiveness. The question was, whom precisely was she protecting? And from what? One does not begin with the crime, Poirot murmured to the empty room. One begins with the heart. He went to dress for dinner, reflecting that the heart, in this particular case, was going to require very careful examination indeed. Chapter 5. Confessions. Within Confessions dinner that evening was a quiet, careful affair, like a piece of music played in a lower key than its composer intended. The carnival masks had been removed from the table settings. Nobody remarked upon their absence. The chandelier burned steadily, the fog having thinned enough to admit a faint wind off the lagoon that made the candles unnecessary, and the room, without them, feel slightly surgical. The manservant moved between the courses with his customary expressionless efficiency, and the guests addressed one another with the determined civility of people who have decided, for the duration of a meal at least, that ordinary social forms are worth preserving. The countess had come down. She sat at the head of the table with her silver hair and her black gown and her steady, unreadable composure, and she discussed the history of the Palazzo's east wing, its 16th century origins, its partial collapse in 1743, its reconstruction with the measured fluency of a woman who has lived inside a story so long that she can recite it from any point. Ferraro asked 2 questions, which she answered. Bellini asked none, and ate with his eyes on his plate. Poirot ate his branzino and listened with that quality of attention that looked to those unfamiliar with it like mere polite interest to what was not being said. After dinner, he excused himself early, pleaded a slight fatigue with the modest self-deprecation of a man who wishes to be underestimated, and went not to his room but to the library, where he had arranged through the quiet intermediary of the manservant to speak with each of his fellow guests in turn. He had not framed these conversations as interrogations. He had described them, to each person, as a private word. The kind of conversation that a man of his experience felt it his duty to offer when a household found itself in difficulty. 3 of them had agreed without hesitation. The 4th had agreed after a pause that told Poirot everything he needed to know about how the evening would proceed. Clara Hastings arrived first, which he had expected, and sat down across from him with the straightforward purposefulness of someone who has already decided what they will and will not say. "You want to know about Luca and Ward," she said, "beyond what I told you this afternoon. I want to know what you yourself observed," said Poirot, "not what you were told. You are a painter, Signora Hastings. You observe. I suspect you observed a great deal more in this household than you have yet shared with anyone." She considered this. Ward sought Luca out on the first evening. After dinner, when the rest of us had gone up, I saw them from the staircase, not speaking, simply standing together near the corridor window, and the way they were standing told me it was not a new acquaintance and not a comfortable one. Ward was smiling. Luca was not. And subsequently? Ward mentioned at breakfast the following morning that there were remarkable documents in certain Venetian private collections. He said it entirely casually, to the table in general, the way a man drops a stone into a pond to watch the rings. She paused. Luca put down his cup, only for a moment, then he picked it up again. "You say Ward held documents concerning a patient, a death. Did you ever hear the name Malumbra in connection with this?" Clara Hastings was still for a beat. "Luca said once that the worst thing a physician could do was not to make an error of judgment. It was to allow someone else's error of judgment to become his own. I did not understand it at the time." She met Poirot's eyes. "I think, perhaps, I understand it better now." Poirot thanked her. She rose, paused at the door, and said without turning, "He is not a bad man, Monsieur Poirot. He made a bad choice 20 years ago, under pressure I can only guess at. There is a difference." "There is," said Poirot, "though it is a difference that the law finds inconvenient." She left without answering, which was itself, he thought, an answer. Ferraro came next, and he came prepared. He settled into the chair with the controlled ease of a man who has rehearsed his composure until it is indistinguishable from the natural article, crossed one leg over the other, and looked at Poirot with the steady, professionally attentive gaze of a physician receiving a difficult patient. "I imagine," he said, "that you wish to discuss Ward." "I wish to discuss Count Malumbra," said Poirot pleasantly. Something shifted in Ferraro's face. Not collapse, nothing so dramatic, but a subtle reorganization as of furniture moved an inch from its accustomed position. He was quiet for 4 full seconds. Then he said, "That is a very old matter." "Old matters," said Poirot, "have a habit of becoming new ones when someone dies." Ferraro looked at his hands. They were, as always, very still. "I was the Count's physician. I attended him on the night of his death, 20 years ago this March. He had been in declining health. Genuinely so, I want that understood. And the death was certified as cardiac failure. There was no inquest. He paused. The certification was accurate as far as it went. As far as it went, Poirot repeated gently. The cardiac failure had a precipitant. Ferraro's voice was level, clinical, as though he were presenting a case to colleagues rather than confessing to a stranger in a library. A substance, introduced into his evening wine. I detected its presence during my examination. I said nothing. His jaw tightened fractionally. The countess was present throughout. She was convincing. And I was a young physician with a recently acquired practice and a great deal to lose, and the count was already dead, and I told myself that nothing would be served by the truth. And Ward had evidence of this. Ward had the count's diary, or had access to it. I do not know how. He was vague on that point, deliberately vague, the way such men are. It recorded the Count's suspicions about his wife in the weeks before his death. And it recorded that I had visited him privately 2 days before he died, at his request, to discuss those suspicions. Ferraro looked up. He had asked me whether a certain compound, in certain quantities, might produce the symptoms he was experiencing. I told him it was possible. I told him to take care. A silence. I did not save him, and after Ward acquired this diary, he approached you. 3 months ago in London, entirely socially to all appearances. He mentioned the diary. He mentioned its contents. He mentioned that he was planning a visit to Venice, where so many interesting things were kept. The word interesting carried in Ferraro's mouth a weight of contempt. He did not name a figure. He did not need to. The architecture of the arrangement was sufficiently clear. Poirot looked at him with the steady, unsentimental attention that he brought to all such moments. Not compassion, precisely, but a kind of grave acknowledgement that the human capacity for moral failure was infinite and deserved to be understood rather than merely condemned. "You did not kill Ward," he said. "It was not a question." "No." Ferraro met his eyes. "I wanted to. I will not pretend otherwise. But I did not." "Where was the diary kept?" "Here, in the Palazzo. Ward brought it with him. He was not so foolish as to leave his only lever unattended. He kept it in his room." Ferraro paused. "After his death, I went to his room. The diary was not there." Poirot filed this information alongside everything else, thanked Ferraro, and watched him leave with the straight-backed precision of a man who has set down something very heavy and is not yet certain he is permitted to feel relieved. Bellini arrived with his satchel, which he set on the floor beside him with the same automatic possessiveness as always, and looked at Poirot with the composed, slightly distant expression of a scholar regarding a problem he has already begun to solve. "You know why I am here," he said. Not a challenge, a statement made with the calm of someone who finds evasion aesthetically objectionable. "Your father," said Poirot. Bellini nodded. "He was a businessman, not a grand one. A modest, careful man who built something over 30 years and lost it in 18 months. The financial scandal of 1907. Perhaps you have heard of it. Several Venetian families were implicated in a fraudulent investment scheme. A number of smaller investors were ruined. My father was among them." His voice was entirely without tremor. "He died in prison in 1909. Convicted of fraud. He was not guilty. He was merely convenient." "And the Malumbra family's connection?" "Count Malumbra was the scheme's principal architect. The smaller men were prosecuted. The Count was not." Bellini's eyes were steady. "He died the following year," before any proper investigation could be mounted, and the matter was quietly interred with him. He paused. When I began this book, I told myself it was scholarship, disinterested inquiry. I had almost convinced myself. "You search the Palazzo archives," said Poirot. A beat. Then, to his credit, Bellini did not deny it. "The Countess gave me access to the family papers. Willingly, I think, because she believed there was nothing in them that could hurt her. She was wrong. There are letters between the Count and his legal advisers from 1906. They are illuminating." He touched the satchel with one finger briefly. "I made copies. And Ward knew you were here, knew what you sought. He approached me, yes. He had his own interest in the Count's history. He had the diary, and the diary, I gather, touched on several matters, including the financial scandal. He proposed an exchange of information." Bellini's mouth compressed slightly. "I declined. Whatever the Count did, the means by which Ward proposed to use the knowledge was repugnant to me." "You did not tell me that you had searched the archives," said Poirot mildly. "You did not ask until now." Bellini looked at him directly. "I did not kill Ward, Monsieur Poirot. I will not say I grieved when I heard what had happened, but I did not kill him." Poirot studied the historian's pale, composed face for a long moment. Then he nodded. "There is one thing more. Did you at any point have access to the Count's diary?" "Ward's copy?" "No." The answer was immediate and, Poirot judged, genuine. "I never saw it. I knew it existed. Ward described its contents in the broadest terms to demonstrate its value." He paused. "He mentioned it recorded the Count's awareness of an illegitimate child. He seemed to think this the most explosive element." The library was very quiet. "Did he?" said Poirot softly, and looked for a moment at no particular point in the middle distance, in the manner of a man watching two separate things resolve, with sudden and irrevocable clarity, into one. He thanked Bellini and sat for some time after the historian left, alone in the library with the old books and the one lamp burning, turning the shape of it over, the full shape of it at last beginning to be visible, in the ordered chambers of his mind. Elena Rossi had not come. He had not expected her to. Chapter 6. Poisoned Soil. He waited until 11 o'clock. The palazzo had settled into its nightly quiet. The particular quiet of old buildings that have absorbed so many human sounds over so many centuries that silence itself seems merely another layer of occupation. From the canal came the occasional shift of water, the distant voice of a reveller making his way home through the Carnival streets, and once, briefly, the thin note of an accordion carried on the wind from somewhere across the rooftops. Poirot sat in the library with a small glass of cognac he was not drinking and thought about a woman who had not come to speak with him, and why. Elena Rossi had moved the safe. Elena Rossi had placed the handkerchief. Elena Rossi had been seen on the night of Ward's death, weeping before a portrait of a man who was almost certainly her father. She had lied to Gavini about her movements after midnight, with the directness of someone who has decided that directness is the safest disguise. And she had declined, with no explanation offered and none apparently felt necessary, to speak with Poirot this evening. All of this was consistent with guilt. The difficulty was that it was equally consistent with something more complicated than guilt, and Poirot had lived too long with the complexity of human beings to mistake the simpler explanation for the truer one simply because it was more convenient. He set down his untouched cognac, rose, and went to find her. She was in the salon, not standing before the portrait this time, but seated in a straight-backed chair near the window in darkness except for the faint luminescence that the canal's surface cast upward through the glass. She was not reading. She was not doing anything at all that Poirot could observe. She was simply sitting in the manner of someone who has run out of the energy required to perform occupation. She heard him enter and did not turn her head. "I thought you would come eventually," she said. Her voice was entirely composed. "You are not a man who accepts an empty chair as a final answer." "On the contrary," said Poirot, settling himself with care into the chair beside her, at a respectful distance, as one sits beside someone in a hospital. "I have the greatest respect for empty chairs. They tell me a great deal." He paused. "Yours told me that whatever you wished to say, you did not wish to say it in the library, where the conversation could be overheard from the corridor, which suggested you wished to speak, only not there and not then." For the first time she looked at him directly. In the canal light her face was pale and very still, and she looked younger than her years, and older than them simultaneously, in the way that certain kinds of knowledge ages and simplifies a person at once. "I will tell you what I can," she said, "and what I cannot tell you I will tell you I cannot, rather than lie. That is the most I can offer." "It is," said Poirot, "considerably more than most people offer. I am grateful." She looked at the window for a moment. The canal moved its slow geometry against the glass. Then she said, "My mother was a servant in this house. She died when I was 4 years old. I was taken in by the Contessa. Not acknowledged, not explained, simply absorbed into the household as Elena, the companion's child, and later the companion herself." A pause. "I knew from the time I was perhaps 12 that I did not belong here in the ordinary sense. There was something in the way the Contessa looked at me. Not unkindly, never unkindly, but with a weight of attention that one does not direct at servants' orphans out of simple charity. You discovered the truth 3 years ago. The Contessa was ill, genuinely ill for several months, and there were papers to be managed, correspondence, the ordinary administration of the estate. I found a letter addressed to the Contessa in her husband's hand, dated 1902. He had discovered my mother's condition. He wished to provide for the child." She stopped. When she resumed, her voice had not changed, but something behind it had shifted an inch. The Contessa's reply was also there. She had kept both letters together. Hers was very short. It said that no acknowledgement of any kind would be made, that my mother would be provided for quietly and removed from the household, and that the matter was closed. And yet she kept you. She kept me. Elena's hands, folded in her lap, were as still as Ferraro's at their most controlled, though they achieved their stillness differently. Not by training, Poirot thought, but by exhaustion. After my mother died, she kept me. She educated me. She treated me, in every practical sense, with, not warmth precisely, but with a kind of constrained duty that I now understand was the nearest thing to love she was capable of directing toward me. She paused. She is a woman who destroyed one life to protect her name, and then spent 20 years taking oblique care of the consequence. I have been trying for 3 years to understand her, and I cannot. Poirot said nothing. The canal made its patient sounds below them. Ward had the Count's diary, Elena continued. He came to me first, before he approached anyone else. He was very pleasant about it. He said the diary recorded my father's intentions regarding me, and that its publication, or its delivery to certain interested parties, would be quite sensational, given the Countess's position. She said the word sensational with the same quality of distaste Clara Hastings had brought to the word lever. He wanted me to arrange a private conversation with the Contessa. He believed I had influence over her. He was not entirely wrong. And you refused him. I told him I needed time to consider. That was not true. What I needed was time to act. She turned to look at Poirot, and her gaze was quite level. I moved the safe 3 weeks ago when I first understood that Ward might come here. The diary and certain other documents had been kept in it for years. The Contessa knew nothing of this. It was the Count's safe, and she had never opened it. Also, I believed. I relocated it to a storeroom in the Cannaregio, where it would not be found easily. I wanted to remove Ward's leverage. But Ward brought his own copy of the diary with him. Yes, I did not know that until he told me. The faintest contraction crossed her face. He was thorough. The night Ward died, said Poirot, with the gentleness of a surgeon choosing his incision. You told Ispettore Gavini you had not seen him after midnight. That was not true. No, said Elena. It was not. She was quiet for a moment. I saw him on the garden terrace at 11:30. He had been waiting for my answer. I told him I would not help him, that whatever he chose to do with the diary, I would not be his means of access to the Contessa. She looked at the window again. He was not angry. Men like Ward are never angry when a plan fails. They simply recalibrate. He said there were other avenues available to him. He was very cheerful about it. He wished me good night, and I went back inside. And he was alive when you left him. He was alive. Her voice was entirely steady. Standing at the railing, looking at the canal, smoking a cigarette. I went upstairs. I did not see him again. Poirot regarded her. She bore his regard without discomfort, without evasion, with the simple patience of someone who has nothing further to hide on this particular point and knows it. He believed her. The handkerchief, he said. A pause, the first real pause of the conversation. I found it at the top of the terrace steps the following morning, before the cook raised the alarm. It was caught against the iron ring at the dock. I recognized it immediately. It was the Contessa's, one of a set she had owned for many years. I took it. She met his eyes. I did not place it where the police found it, Monsieur Poirot. I took it away. I put it in my pocket and I took it away because I did not want it found. Poirot was very still. Then how did it come to be found at the foot of the steps? Something moved through Eleanor's composed expression, not confusion, but the particular arrested quality of a mind encountering a fact that reorders everything adjacent to it. I don't understand, she said slowly. I had it. I put it in the pocket of my morning coat. I had it all morning. And then, she stopped. Her eyes went to the window, not seeing it. I hung the coat in my room at midday. I did not return to it until the afternoon. By then the police had already... She stopped again. By then, said Poirot quietly, the police had already found the handkerchief at the dock, which means that between midday and the early afternoon, someone entered your room, took the handkerchief from your coat pocket, returned to the dock, and placed it where it would be found. He allowed the silence a moment to accommodate this. Someone knew you had taken it. Someone watched you take it. And someone used that knowledge to direct suspicion toward the Contessa, while simultaneously ensuring that you could not produce the handkerchief as proof of its earlier removal. Elena stared at him. The canal light shifted across her face. "This person," said Poirot with great care, "was not protecting the Contessa. They were exposing her, and they were making certain that you could not intervene." He paused. "Is it possible to belong somewhere that refuses to see you?" he added very softly, repeating back to her the question she had asked him on that first night in this very room. Her breath caught, only slightly, but he heard it. "You asked me that question," said Poirot, "and I did not answer it. I will answer it now. Yes, it is entirely possible. And it is, I think, the question at the centre of everything that has happened in this palazzo." He rose, smoothing his coat with both hands. "Thank you, Signorina Rossi. You have been more helpful than you perhaps realize." He left her sitting in the canal light with the expression of someone who has just understood, with sudden and not entirely welcome clarity, that the story they thought they were inside is considerably larger than they had imagined. He was halfway up the stairs when he heard it. From the corridor above, from the direction of Bellini's room, the sound of movement, rapid and purposeful, followed by a door opening and closing with a force that stopped just short of a slam. Then silence. Poirot stood on the landing. His hand rested lightly on the banister. He waited a full 30 seconds, counting without hurry, before he ascended the remaining stairs and turned into the corridor. Bellini's door was closed. From beneath it, no light showed. But the door to the room beyond, the small, rarely used guest room that stood between Bellini's quarters and the corridor's end, stood 3 inches open, and within it, on the floor where it had evidently been, dropped or pushed, lay a leather satchel whose brass clasp had been forced and now hung bent and open. The satchel was empty. Poirot looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then he looked at the corridor, in both directions, which offered him only darkness and the old palazzo's patient silence. The letters Bellini had copied from the Malumbra archive, the letters that evidenced the Count's role in the financial ruin of a generation of smaller men, were gone. Someone, it appeared, had not finished with the Count's history, and someone had decided this evening that Bellini's copy of it was not to leave the palazzo. Chapter 7. What the wall remembered Poirot did not sleep. He sat instead in the armchair by his window in the complete and rather companionable darkness, with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes open, and allowed the little grey cells to do what they did best, which was not, as some people supposed, to search for evidence, but to arrange what was already known into configurations of increasing honesty, until one configuration refused to be improved upon. By 3 in the morning, the canal below was entirely silent, and Poirot had arrived at a configuration that refused to be improved upon. He did not find it comfortable. He had not expected to. He thought about 2 theories he had entertained and largely discarded: the Countess as killer, Ferraro as killer, and understood now why each had satisfied only part of the evidence. Each explained the poison, each explained the motive, but neither explained the handkerchief. Once Elena's account of it was accepted, why an innocent person would remove it, and why a guilty person would steal it back, and why both these actions pointed not toward a crime committed in panic or passion, but toward one planned with the cold, patient intelligence of someone who had been thinking about it for a very long time. He thought about the safe, moved 3 weeks before Ward's arrival. He thought about the locksmith's receipt, left or dropped in the escritoire drawer where someone other than Eleanor might find it, or might not. He thought about the satchel with its forced brass clasp, lying on the floor of a room that was not Bellini's own, which meant that whoever had taken the letters had either moved them there deliberately or had been surprised mid-act and dropped them in flight, and in either case had been somewhere in that corridor at approximately 11 o'clock on an evening when every other guest could reasonably account for their whereabouts. And then Poirot thought, with the particular quality of attention he reserved for the things that had been there from the beginning and had simply waited to be looked at properly, about the painting. Not the painting that had been removed from above the escritoire, the painting that had replaced it. At 6:30, he dressed with his customary precision, descended to the salon and stood before the painting that now hung above the escritoire in the place of its predecessor. It was a landscape, Venetian, 18th century, competent rather than distinguished, depicting the lagoon in afternoon light with a distant view of the island churches. Poirot had registered it on his first evening and filed it as unremarkable, which was, he now understood, precisely what it had been chosen to be. He lifted it from its hooks with both hands. It was lighter than the wall-mounted frame suggested, and it came away cleanly to reveal, behind it, exactly what he had deduced was there. The wall safe was gone, of course. Eleanor had removed it weeks ago, but the recess it had occupied was still there. A rectangular cavity in the old plaster, perhaps 30 centimetres across, its interior surface marked with the small scars and impressions of long habitation. At its base, wedged into the gap between the plaster and the floor of the recess with the purposeful compactness of something, concealed rather than forgotten, was a slim volume bound in dark green leather. Poirot examined it without removing it. The binding was old, but not ancient, perhaps 40 years, he estimated. The initials on the front cover, tooled in gold now somewhat dulled, read A.M., not Alessandra. Alberto. The Count's diary had not been in Ward's room when Ferrara went to search it, because it had never been in Ward's room. Ward had used the diary as leverage for months and understood its value precisely. A man of his particular profession does not carry his only instrument of persuasion on his person when safer arrangements are available. He had located the old safe, had perhaps known of it before he arrived, from wherever he had first obtained knowledge of the diary's existence, and had used it as his repository, which had the additional elegance of hiding the diary in the one place in the Palazzo that its owner would never choose to search. He could not have known that Elena had already removed the safe, and so the diary had remained where Ward left it, tucked into the recess behind a landscape of the lagoon, through his death and the subsequent days of investigation, waiting with the patience of inanimate objects for someone to ask the correct question. Poirot lifted the diary out with 2 careful fingers and carried it to the escritoire. He read for 40 minutes. The Count's hand was expansive, educated, occasionally self-dramatizing in the manner of a man who considered his inner life to be of considerable general interest. The early entries were routine. Estate matters, social engagements, observations on Venetian society of the period that were sharp enough to be diverting. But in the final 3 months, beginning in September of the year before his death, the diary changed character entirely. He had discovered Elena's mother's pregnancy himself, not been told of it, as the countess had claimed in her letter, but discovered it through the ordinary machinery of a household in which servants were not entirely invisible. His response, as recorded, was complex. Guilt, certainly, and a genuine concern for the child, but also something more ambivalent. The desire to do right tangled with the fear of what doing right would cost. And beneath both of these, the particular anxiety of a man who has always relied upon his wife's management of difficult things and is no longer certain he can trust her management of this particular one. He had confided in Ferraro. This was there in plain terms. The entry in which he described asking his physician whether a certain compound, in certain quantities, might produce the symptoms he had been experiencing. The entry was dated 4 days before his death. He had written, "I believe she knows that I know. I believe she is afraid. Whether her fear will make her reasonable or unreasonable, I cannot yet determine." Ferraro urges caution. I am cautious by nature. I wonder if this time caution is wisdom or merely cowardice. The final entry was dated the day before he died. It was brief. He had written, "She wishes to discuss the matter this evening. I have agreed to see her privately. God forgive us both whatever comes of it. After that, nothing." The remaining pages of the diary were blank. Poirot closed the green cover with great care and sat for a moment with his hands flat on it, not moving. The salon was still in the early morning light, the frescoed gods and nymphs indistinct above him, the chandelier motionless. From the canal came the first sounds of the working city beginning its day. The low rumble of a delivery boat, the call of a man to another man on a distant fondamenta. The architecture of the crime, as he had begun to describe it to himself, was now complete. Not as a theory, as a fact. The countess had poisoned her husband on the evening of their private conversation. Ferraro had covered it. Ward had discovered both the diary and, through some channel, not yet entirely clear, the letters connecting the Count to the financial scandal, which gave him simultaneous leverage over the Contessa and over Ferraro, and over the Malumbra reputation generally, a sufficiency of leverage for a man of Ward's particular appetites. Elena had learned of the diary's existence and had moved the safe to protect the household she could not stop belonging to. And then someone had poisoned Ward, someone who knew about the diary. Someone who had been in this palazzo long enough to observe where Ward kept it. Someone who had watched Elena remove the handkerchief from the dock steps and had seen immediately how it could be used. Poirot rose and replaced the diary with precision in the recess behind the landscape and rehung the painting on its hooks and stepped back to verify that it hung straight. It hung very straight. He straightened it a further fraction regardless. He needed one more thing. Not evidence. He had evidence in abundance. What he needed was the single piece of testimony that would complete the chain so that no subsequent argument could find a gap in it. And he knew, with the resigned certainty of long experience, where that testimony would have to come from, and how little the person who held it would wish to surrender it. He found Bellini at breakfast, alone, nursing coffee with the hollow-eyed distraction of a man who has not slept and has spent the sleepless hours in the company of his own anger. "The letters," said Poirot, sitting across from him without preamble. Bellini looked up. "Gone. I told you last night." "You told me the satchel was empty. I am asking now who you saw or heard in the corridor between 10 and 11 o'clock. A long pause. Bellini set down his cup. "I was in my room from 9 o'clock. At approximately 10:30 I heard footsteps outside my door, unhurried, deliberate. A few minutes later I heard the door of the small guest room open and close. I assumed it was one of the servants." His mouth compressed. I was, in retrospect, not sufficiently curious. The footsteps, said Poirot. Light or heavy? Light. Bellini looked at him. A woman's step. Poirot nodded once, as though this confirmed something he had already ceased to doubt. One more question. The financial letters. You said you made copies. Were the copies in the satchel? Bellini's expression shifted, the first unguarded movement Poirot had seen from him. It contained, in roughly equal measure, caution and something that might have been satisfaction. The copies in the satchel, he said carefully, were copies. Poirot regarded him, meaning the originals are elsewhere. Meaning, said Bellini, that I have been a historian for 20 years, and historians do not keep their primary sources in satchels. He picked up his coffee cup. Whatever was taken last night, Monsieur Poirot, was not irreplaceable. Poirot permitted himself a small, genuine smile, the smile of a man who finds in an otherwise oppressive morning one detail that pleases him. You are, he said, a careful man, Monsieur Bellini. I am my father's son, said Bellini, without inflection. Poirot rose from the table. There was one conversation remaining, the one he had been moving toward since the first evening, since the moment he had stood in the doorway of the salon and watched Elena Rossi weep before a portrait in the dark. He had been avoiding it, not from reluctance, but because he had understood from the beginning that it was the conversation upon which everything else depended, and that it could not be rushed or approached until every other piece was in its proper place. Every piece was now in its proper place. He went to find the Countess. Chapter 8. The Mirror and the Mask. The Countess received him in her private sitting room on the second floor, a room that had not been offered to any other guest, and that Poirot, ascending the stairs at the manservant's direction, understood immediately as a statement rather than a courtesy. She was choosing the ground. It was a beautiful room. Smaller than the public spaces below, it had the quality of somewhere genuinely inhabited. Books with broken spines on the shelves, a writing desk whose surface bore the evidence of regular use. A small icon above the fireplace of the sort that Venetian families of a certain age keep not from piety, but from habit. 2 chairs were set at an angle to the window, which gave onto the narrow canal below, and in one of these the Countess was already seated, very upright in a morning dress of grey wool. She did not rise when Poirot entered. She indicated the second chair with one hand, and he sat. For a moment, neither spoke. Through the window, the canal offered its usual indifferent pageant, a delivery boat, the slow progress of a sandolo, the far wall of the opposing building, with its shutters still closed against the morning. The Countess looked at Poirot with the dark, level eyes that had regarded every guest in her dining room with exactly the same measured attention. And Poirot looked back at her with the patient stillness of a man who has all the time in the world and knows that the other person in the room does not. "You have found the diary," she said at last. "I have found it," said Poirot, "and you have read it." Not a question. A statement of fact delivered without inflection in the manner of someone closing an account. "I have." The Countess turned her gaze to the window. A long silence settled over the room. Not the silence of evasion, Poirot thought, but of a woman deciding, with the same methodical deliberateness she brought to every decision, precisely how much of the truth she intended to surrender, and in what order. He waited. He was, he reflected, very good at waiting. "Alberto was not a bad man," she said finally. "He was a weak one. There is a distinction, though I am not certain the law appreciates it. She paused. He allowed himself to be persuaded into things he knew were wrong, because the men who persuaded him were persuasive, and because he could not endure conflict. The financial matter, you know about it, I imagine, from Bellini, who has his father's grievance and his father's eyes, and has been sitting at my table waiting to use them. That was not Alberto's conception, but it was Alberto's signature on certain documents, and Alberto's name on certain transactions, and when it collapsed, he was very willing to allow others to bear the consequences he had helped to create. She said this without apparent emotion, the flat recitation of an old indictment. I do not excuse it. I state it. And the child, said Poirot quietly. The Countess was still for a moment in the particular way of someone absorbing a blow they have been expecting. He told me in September. He was, he said, prepared to acknowledge the child publicly, to provide for her in his will, to introduce her to society as his daughter by a woman who had died in his household service. Her voice remained entirely level. He framed this as the honourable course. He may even have believed it. But you did not. I had given 20 years to this family, to this house, to his name. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The precision of her diction was entirely sufficient. I had managed his affairs, his estates, his social position, and on more than one occasion, his consequences. I was not prepared to be displaced in my own house by a servant's child, because Alberto had developed a late and inconvenient conscience. She paused. I told him so. He said he had made his decision. We agreed to discuss it privately, in the evening. And in the evening, said Poirot, you put something in his wine. The Countess turned from the window and looked at him directly. Her expression was not guilt and not defiance. It was something considerably harder to name. The look of a person who has lived for 20 years inside a decision and has long since passed through every available moral response to arrive at something on the far side of them all. His health was genuinely poor, she said. The cardiac failure would have come regardless within a year or two. Ferraro had told me as much. She paused. I merely arranged for it to come sooner. And Ferraro, said Poirot. He knew. He suspected. There is a difference. A brief, dry compression of her mouth that might, in another context, have approached a smile. He was young and ambitious and frightened, and he chose not to ask the question whose answer would have destroyed him. I have not blamed him for it. Fear is a reasonable response to unreasonable circumstances. I merely took note of the fact that he had made his choice against the day when that knowledge might be useful. She folded her hands in her lap. Ward was not the first person to discover that Ferraro had been present that evening. He was simply the first to understand what to do with it. Ward, said Poirot, had the diary, and with it a full account of your husband's suspicions, the names of his physicians, and the record of your private conversation. He came here intending to extract a considerable sum. From you, from Ferraro, and perhaps from Eleanor, whom he appears to have considered a useful instrument. He watched her face. He was thorough. He was, said the Countess, an exceptionally unpleasant man, though I have known worse. Poirot looked at her steadily. You did not kill him. Something passed through the Countess's composed face, something too swift and too complex to be catalogued. No, she said, I did not. The night Ward died, said Poirot. You were in your apartments from 10 o'clock onward. Your door was locked. The manservant can confirm that he brought you chamomile at 10:30, and that your light was visible beneath the door until past midnight. He paused. You were, for perhaps the first time in this affair, entirely innocent of the event occurring below you. How very ironic, said the countess, without irony. He waited a moment, then set before her the question he had been keeping in reserve. The night ward died. Did Elena come to you? The silence that followed was of a different quality from all the preceding silences. It had texture, weight. She came at 11:30, said the countess at last. She told me Ward had refused to desist. She said he would expose everything, Alberto's death, the financial matter, her own origins, unless I agreed to meet his terms. She was very calm. The countess stopped. She was always very calm. It was a quality I encouraged in her from childhood because it was useful, and I am not proud of that, looking back. What did you tell her? I told her I would not meet his terms, that I had spent 20 years protecting the Malumbra name and would not surrender it to a man like Ward. She paused. I told her that everything he threatened to expose concerned the past, and that the past could not hurt us if we refused to be afraid of it. Another pause, longer. I was not certain I believed that, but I wanted her to leave the room with something to hold on to. And she left. She left. She kissed my hand. She had not done that since she was a child. And she went. The countess looked at the window. I did not know until this moment what she did afterward, but I am not surprised. She was quiet. She has always believed that protecting me was her purpose. I allowed her to believe it because it was convenient, and that is perhaps the thing I am least able to forgive myself. Poirot regarded the Countess of Malumbra, this composed, formidable woman who had poisoned one man to preserve her name, and had spent 20 years performing a constrained and complicated version of maternal duty toward the child that name was meant to exclude, and felt, not for the first time in his long career, the particular weariness of understanding more than he wished to. You know what must happen, he said. I know what will happen, the Countess replied. The distinction was subtle and deliberate. Eleanor killed Ward to protect me. She used information she obtained from me. I see that now, though I did not see it that night. And she acted with a purposefulness that she learned, God help us both, from watching me for 28 years. She rose with perfect steadiness and moved to the writing desk. I have been considering, since you entered this room, whether there is any version of the truth in which Eleanor does not suffer for what she has done. She turned to face him. I find there is not, but there is a version in which she does not suffer alone. You intend to speak with Gavini, said Poirot. I intend, said the Countess, to tell the Ispettore everything about my husband's death. All of it, without omission. She lifted her chin slightly, in the manner of someone settling the angle of a burden they intend to carry properly. If Elena is to face justice for Ward, then I will face justice for Alberto. It seems to me the least inadequate arrangement available. Poirot was quiet for a moment. Then he said, There is one thing remaining. The diary must be recovered from its present location and given to the Ispettore, and Eleanor must be told before he speaks to her that you have made your decision. She deserves to know that she will not carry this alone. He paused. She has always carried too much alone. Something crossed the Countess's face. Not quite grief, not quite recognition, but something in the territory between them. She said nothing. Poirot rose and crossed to the door. On the threshold he turned back, as was his habit when a final observation seemed to be required. "You asked me on the first evening whether I found the Palazzo comfortable," he said. "I told you it was most civilized. I should perhaps have been more precise. It is a house in which a great deal of civilized behavior has been used to accomplish uncivilized ends." He considered the icon above the fireplace for a moment. "That is not, I think, beyond remedy, but it will require more courage than comfort." The countess looked at him. "You are a remarkable man, Monsieur Poirot." "I am a Belgian," said Poirot with perfect seriousness, "who is occasionally required to point out things that other people have been too busy to notice." He inclined his head. "Buona giornata, Contessa." He descended the stairs with the measured tread of a man whose work in this particular room was complete, and whose work in the next room, the hardest room, the one he had been postponing since the beginning, was about to begin. Chapter 9. All masks removed. He arranged it for 11 o'clock, not in the library where conversations had the quality of confessions, private, contained, the weight of them absorbed by books and closed doors. Poirot chose the salon, which was the appropriate room for a conclusion. The room where the Carnival masks had decorated the dinner table on that first evening, where the frescoed gods watched from their fading heaven, where the portrait of Count Alberto Malumbra looked out from the wall with the permanent authority of the dead over the living. He asked the manservant to place the Count's diary at the centre of the table. He asked Gavini to be present, unobtrusively, near the door. And then he waited while the guests filed in with the uncertain quality of people who have been summoned without being told why, which produces in most people a mixture of apprehension and the determination not to show it. Clara Hastings came first and sat with her arms folded and her painter's gaze moving across the room as though composing it. Bellini entered next, took in the diary on the table in a single glance, and arranged his expression with the swift, practiced neutrality of a scholar who has learned to keep his reactions interior. Ferraro came in behind him, saw the diary, and went very still for precisely the count of 2 before he continued to his chair. The Countess entered last. She wore her black, as always, and her silver hair was dressed with its customary art, and she moved with the unhurried composure that Poirot had come to understand was not indifference, but armour of a particular, long-forged kind. She sat at the head of the table, looked at the diary, and then looked at Poirot. He gave her a small nod. She received it without expression. Elena Rossi was not in the room. Poirot had spoken with her first, privately, for 12 minutes in the corridor outside the salon. He would not describe that conversation to anyone subsequently, and he did not describe it now. It was sufficient to say that when it ended, Elena had gone upstairs to her room, and that what she carried with her when she went was the knowledge that she would not face what was coming entirely without witness. He began. "I will tell you a story," said Poirot from his position at the side of the table, with the diary before him and the portrait of the Count above and behind him, which he had chosen with some deliberateness. "It begins, as all Venetian stories must, with the water, with the canal below this room, and with what was put into it 3 nights ago, and with why." He spoke for some time. He spoke about a marriage, and about what is done in the service of a name. He spoke about a physician at the bedside of a dying man who understood what he saw and chose not to say so. He spoke about a child raised in the margins of a household that could not decide whether to acknowledge her or expel her, and who had consequently become, over 28 years, a person of extraordinary competence and extraordinary loneliness. He spoke about a financier who collected other people's secrets with the cheerful industry of a man who has never understood that secrets are not commodities, but living things, and that living things resist. He spoke about the diary, what it contained, where it was found, what it proved, and he placed his hand on the green cover as he did so, without opening it, because the gesture was sufficient. He watched the room as he spoke, the small, telling adjustments of posture and expression, the moments of stillness that were more revealing than movement, the one instance in which Clara Hastings closed her eyes briefly, not in distress, but in the manner of someone receiving a confirmation they had long suspected and had hoped, against reason, to be wrong about. He had been speaking for perhaps 8 minutes when Ferraro said, in a voice entirely without effect, "I wish to say something." Poirot stopped. "Please," he said. Ferraro looked at the table. "The death certificate for Count Malumbra was signed by me. The cause of death I recorded was cardiac failure. That was accurate in the sense that his heart stopped." He paused. It was not accurate in any other sense. I knew at the time that there was a precipitant. I said nothing. I have said nothing for 20 years. His hands were folded in front of him on the table, and they were, for the first time in Poirot's observation of them, not entirely still. I am prepared to make a complete statement to the Ispettore. I should have made it 20 years ago. I did not, and I cannot recover that failure, but I can decline to compound it any further. The room received this. Clara Hastings looked at Ferraro, and what was in her face was not absolution. She was too clear-eyed for that. But something that acknowledged the cost of what he had just done and did not diminish it. Bellini, who had been watching Ferraro with the expression of a man revising a long-held assessment, said quietly, "The letters from the Malumbra archive, the letters implicating the Count in the 1907 scheme. I have the originals. I am prepared to deposit them with the appropriate authorities." He glanced at the countess. "My father's name was not restored by his imprisonment. I do not suppose it will be restored by disclosure 20 years after his death. But the record will be accurate, and that is, in the end, what I came here to accomplish." The countess had listened to all of this without moving. Now she spoke. "When my husband told me he intended to acknowledge the child," she said, addressing no particular person, her gaze directed at the diary on the table, "I understood it as a form of destruction, of me, of this house, of everything I had spent my life maintaining." She paused. "I do not revise that understanding. I revise only the conclusion I drew from it, which was that destruction justified prevention by any means available." Another pause. Longer, the weight of it perceptible in the room's altered stillness. "I was wrong. I have known for some time that I was wrong. I have found it more convenient to know it privately than to say so aloud." She looked up, and her dark eyes were perfectly steady. "I will speak to the Ispettore this afternoon." The door opened. Elena Rossi stood in the doorway. She had changed into a dark coat, as though already dressed for departure, and her face held the composed, depleted expression of someone who has been through the worst of something and emerged on the far side of it into a strange, flat calm. She looked at the room, at the countess, at the diary on the table, at Poirot. And then she came in and closed the door behind her and stood at the foot of the table. "You should sit," said Poirot gently. I prefer to stand." She looked at him directly. "You told me this morning that you knew. I should like to know what it is precisely that you know, so that there is no confusion between us about what is mine to answer for." It was, Poirot thought, a remarkably precise request from a remarkably precise woman. "Very well," he said. "You spoke with Ward on the terrace on the night of his death. You told him you would not assist him. You returned inside. Subsequently, we do not know exactly when, but between midnight and 2 in the morning, you obtained a substance, almost certainly from the Palazzo's own stores, which you introduced into a glass of wine left on the garden table, where Ward was accustomed to drink when he came onto the terrace at night. He returned to the terrace. He drank. He died there and was then moved to the canal steps." Poirot paused. "The wine glass set apart on the kitchen draining board was yours to manage. You wrapped it because it retained the residue." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, simply and entirely. "You did not kill him for yourself," said Poirot. "Or not primarily. He would have destroyed everything." Her voice was level. "Not only the Contessa, though that too. He would have published my origins for the entertainment of people who consider such things entertaining. He would have ruined Ferraro and Bellini's work and the reputation of a house that is, whatever else it may be, the only home I have known." She paused. "I understood that these were not sufficient reasons. I acted on them regardless." The room was very quiet. "You love too much," said Poirot, quietly. He had known since the night in the salon, since her question about belonging, that this was the truest and most terrible thing that could be said about Elena Rossi. And he said it now, not as condemnation, but as the simple, inadequate acknowledgement it was. "But love does not grant the right to kill. You know this." "Yes," said Eleanor for the second time. "I know it." Something moved in her face then. Not relief exactly, but the expression of someone for whom the end of concealment is itself a kind of rest. She had been carrying the weight of it with the extraordinary competence she brought to everything, and the weight had not broken her, and it had not comforted her, and now it was set down, and whatever came next would come. Across the table the Countess rose from her chair. She crossed the room with the straight, unhurried step that was her characteristic manner of moving through the world, and she stood before Eleanor, and she looked at her, truly looked at her, with a completeness of attention that had never, in 28 years, been offered. And then she took Elena's face in both hands, briefly, in a gesture that was not an apology because the word was nowhere near sufficient, and was not absolution because that was not hers to give. It was, simply, the first entirely honest thing the Countess of Malumbra had done in 20 years. Elena's composure held, her eyes did not. The Contessa stepped back, and Elena looked away towards the window, and the canal below received their silence as it received everything else. Without comment, without judgment, moving always in one direction. Gavini entered from the door with the quiet purposefulness of a man who has been waiting a long time and is now very certain of what he intends to do. Poirot retreated to the edge of the room and watched the necessary arrangements begin. The formal words, the careful noting of names, the process by which private catastrophe is converted into official record. It was not a beautiful process. It was, however, a just one, and Poirot had long ago made his peace with the distinction. Clara Hastings appeared beside him, very quietly, as though she had drifted there without intention. She stood with her arms at her sides, watching. You knew, said Poirot, not looking at her. I suspected, she said. There is a difference. He permitted himself a small smile. So there is. They stood in companionable and melancholy silence, while the ispettore did his work, and the portrait of Count Malumbra looked down from the wall upon the room where his history was finally, irrevocably, becoming the truth. Chapter 10. After the storm, Venice did not pause. This was, Poirot reflected, one of the city's more instructive qualities. Empires had risen and declined at its edges. Plagues had moved through its narrow calle like unwelcome guests who stayed too long. Floods had climbed its doorsteps and retreated, year upon year, with the patient repetition of something that intends, eventually, to prevail. The city had absorbed all of it and continued, with the sublime indifference of a place that understands itself, to be older than its present difficulties. Carnival continued too. From his window on the morning after the gathering in the salon, Poirot could hear the distant drums and the bright, disordered music from the Campo San Polo, and the occasional cry of revellers whose pleasure was undiminished by the fact that in a palazzo on a narrow canal some distance away, justice had spent the previous afternoon doing its careful, necessary work. Elena had been taken to the questura by Gavini at 4 o'clock, with a composure so complete that the ispettore, hardened as he was to the varieties of human response to arrest, had remarked upon it afterward to Poirot in terms of quiet professional respect. She had said nothing beyond what she had already said in the salon. She had not retracted. She had not embellished. She had, in some sense that Poirot found both admirable and deeply sorrowful, appeared relieved. The countess had given her statement in her private sitting room to Gavini himself for 3 hours. Poirot did not know its precise contents. He did not need to. The broad shape of it was in the diary, and the diary was now in Gavini's custody, and what would follow from that would follow through channels whose proceedings Poirot had no power to alter and no desire to circumvent. Ferraro had departed the Palazzo that evening, not arrested, not yet, but accompanied by an officer and carrying the expression of a man who understands that the interval between the present moment and formal consequence is simply a question of administrative timing. He had paused in the entrance hall, his coat on, his bag in hand, and had looked at nothing in particular for a moment before he walked out through the door. Clara Hastings had been on the stairs. She had not spoken to him, neither had she looked away. Bellini left on Thursday morning. He came to find Poirot in the courtyard, where Poirot was taking the pale winter sun on the stone bench beside the ancient well with the contentment of a man who has earned his idleness. Bellini set his bag on the ground and sat beside him, and for a moment they shared the courtyard's quiet in the manner of two people who do not need to account for their silence. "I have deposited the letters with the court archive," Bellini said at last. "The historian in me insists on noting that they will sit in a file for decades, most probably, and may never be read by anyone who is not paid to summarize them." A pause. "The son in me does not find this entirely satisfying." "No," said Poirot, "I imagine not. And yet—" "And yet," Bellini agreed. He looked at the orange tree, which was beginning, tentatively, to suggest the possibility of new growth at the tips of its older branches. "My father was not a wise man. He was not a brave one. He followed where others led and trusted people who had no intention of deserving it. And he paid a price that I have spent 20 years deciding whether to call unjust or simply excessive." He was quiet for a moment. I think I shall call it excessive. It is a more useful category. You are, as I said, a careful man, said Poirot. I am becoming one. Bellini rose, retrieved his bag, and offered his hand. Poirot shook it. Will the book be written, do you think? Bellini asked. Not of Poirot precisely. The question had the quality of something directed at the air or at the orange tree or at the general proposition of continuance. After all this? I think, said Poirot, that it will be a better book for all this, more honest perhaps about the cost of the things it describes. He considered. The best histories are written by people who understand that they are not merely recording the past. They are deciding what the past means. That is a considerable responsibility, and you are, I believe, equal to it. Bellini looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked through the courtyard arch and out of the Palazzo, without looking back. Clara Hastings stayed another week. She painted every morning, returning to the Palazzo at midday with her coat flecked and her notebook full, and she ate lunch alone and worked in her room through the afternoons on something she did not show anyone. On the 5th day she knocked on the door of Poirot's room and presented him, without ceremony or explanation, with a small watercolour she had done from the upper terrace, the canal below, the opposing wall, the flat winter light on the water. It was painted with the merciless honesty he had come to associate with her work. No prettiness, no consolation, no Venice of the tourist imagination. Just the canal, exactly as it was. I find I cannot paint the masks, she said. I have tried 3 times. They come out wrong, too sinister or too decorative, neither of which is what they actually are. She looked at the painting in Poirot's hands. What they actually are is just objects. They are not responsible for what the people wearing them do. No, said Poirot. That has always been true of masks. She nodded and went away, and on the 7th day she packed her things and left for the station, and the Palazzo contracted slightly in her absence, as places do when a large presence departs them. On the 9th day Poirot visited Elena. The questura permitted the visit for 30 minutes, in a plain room with a table and 2 chairs and a window that gave onto a courtyard of different character from the Malumbras. No orange tree, no old well, only gravel, and a single lamp that burned through the day, regardless of the weather. She was thinner, and she held herself with the deliberate straightness of someone conserving energy for purposes that matter and declining to spend it on purposes that do not. She looked at Poirot when he sat down and waited in her accustomed manner for him to establish the direction of the conversation. He did not have a great deal to tell her that she did not know. He told her that Gavini was a thorough man and, in his experience, thorough men, when they encountered cases of genuine complexity, sometimes allowed that complexity to inform their recommendations. He told her that the Countess's confession had been made completely, and that its consequences were proceeding through the courts with a comprehensiveness that would, at minimum, distribute the weight of the affair more broadly than it would otherwise have fallen. He told her that Bellini's letters were in the archive, and that the financial scandal of 1907 now had, at least in the historical record, a more accurate account of its architecture. Elena listened to all of this and said, "She came yesterday." Poirot was still. "The Contessa, she came for an hour." Elena looked at the courtyard window. "She sat there where you are sitting, and she talked for most of the time about the Palazzo's east wing, its history, the 1743 collapse, the reconstruction. The things she always talks about when she does not know how to talk about other things. A pause. At the end, she said that she had instructed her advocate to act on my behalf, as well as her own, in all matters that could be treated jointly. She said it very quickly, as though it were an administrative detail. Then she stood up and straightened her gloves, and she left. Poirot said nothing. "It is not enough," said Elena, with the clear-eyed precision that was her characteristic mode of truth-telling. "It is nowhere near enough, and she knows it, and I know it, and I do not think either of us is under any illusion that it constitutes a settlement of the account between us." She looked at her hands. "But it is the most she is capable of, and I find, rather to my own surprise, that I can receive it as what it is, rather than condemning it for what it is not." She paused. "I have been trying to understand her for 3 years. I think I have, at last, understood that understanding her is not the same as forgiving her, and that forgiving her is not the same as belonging to her, and that belonging to her has never been the same as being at peace." She looked up. "These are distinctions I should have made rather earlier." "We all arrive at such distinctions," said Poirot, "in the fullness of time." "You are being kind," she said. "I am being accurate," he replied. "There is often a resemblance." For the first time, Elena Rossi smiled at him. Not the composed social expression he had observed throughout, but something smaller and more genuine, briefer, and therefore more valuable. The 30 minutes were almost done. Poirot rose, replaced his chair at its exact angle to the table, and looked at her with the grave, unsentimental regard that was his form of acknowledgement for people who had endured things that deserved to be acknowledged. "Courage," he said simply. "I find I have more of it than I expected," said Elena. "That is, I suppose, the one useful thing that has come out of all this." He left Venice on a Saturday at dawn. His suitcase was packed with the geometric precision that his valet would have recognized and approved of. Each item in its designated position. Nothing superfluous, nothing omitted. The water taxi arrived at the Palazzo's private landing at 6 o'clock, and Poirot descended the steps with his hat correctly placed and his coat correctly buttoned, and his small frame carrying its customary air of contained, self-sufficient order. He did not look back at the Palazzo as the taxi moved away. He never looked back at the scene of a concluded case. It was a sentimentality he had long ago decided he could not afford and did not, in any case, find useful. What had happened here had happened. The canal would carry the water past the Palazzo's steps, as it always had, and the carnival crowds would eventually thin, and the fog would lift, and the city would continue with its sublime indifference toward the future. He sat in the forward cabin as the taxi moved through the narrowing and widening of the canals toward the station, watching the city slide past in the early light with the attentiveness he brought to everything. The washing strung between windows, the cats on the bridge steps, the particular way the morning caught the surface of the water between the buildings and turned it briefly to something that resembled, if not quite gold, then at least the aspiration toward it. He thought, as he had thought on the journey from the Palazzo, about love grown in poisoned soil. He had used the phrase to himself in the privacy of his own mind, in the sleepless hours of the case, and he had not been entirely satisfied with it. It was too neat, too epigrammatic, and the thing it described was neither neat nor epigrammatic, but ragged and human, and old as any family and any house. Elena had not loved the countess because the countess deserved it. She had loved her because love of that particular kind, the love of a child for the only home it has been given, however inadequate that home may be, does not require desert. It requires only duration and the absence of a sufficient alternative. This was not, Poirot reflected, a comfortable conclusion. It did not resolve into anything instructive. It was simply stubbornly true. The station appeared ahead, its white facade emerging from the morning. The taxi slowed. Poirot gathered his hat and his small bag with the economical gestures of a practiced traveller and prepared himself for the transition from one world to the next. He did not think he would return to Venice. He thought this every time, and it was never entirely true, and he was aware of this, and he set the awareness aside with the other things he carried that did not pack neatly. Behind him in the Palazzo Malumbra, the salon stood empty in the early light. The manservant had not yet come down to open the shutters. The chandelier was still. The frescoed gods occupied their positions on the upper walls with their blurred expressions that might have been rapture or dismay. The portrait of Count Alberto Malumbra looked out from its frame with the permanent, unsatisfiable gaze of a man who had wanted, in the end, only to do the right thing, and had not managed to do it in time. On the dining table where the carnival masks had stood on the first evening, sat one mask that nobody had removed, gilt, blank-featured, tilted slightly on the polished wood as though it had turned to look at the door through which the last guest had departed. The canal moved past the Palazzo's foundations in the silence as it had moved for 500 years, carrying whatever the city placed upon it towards the lagoon and the open water beyond, where everything Venice releases eventually goes. Somewhere in the building a bell note sounded. From which room, from which object, for what cause, it was impossible to determine. And then was gone, leaving the kind of silence that follows a sound one cannot explain and does not quite forget.